She made him tea every single night. She set it on the counter. She watched him drink it. And she said absolutely nothing, because she already knew what was in it. She had known for 3 months, and she had been waiting. Most people, when they discover the person they share a bed with has been poisoning them, they run, they scream, they pick up the phone, and they call the police in a panic, still shaking, still unable to believe what they found. Most people don't stay. Most people don't stay calm. Most people don't keep making the tea. But Sandra Calloway was not most people, and the story of what happened inside a quiet ranch house on the outskirts of Richmond, Indiana, in the fall of 2021, is one of the most extraordinary acts of quiet, courage and cold-blooded patience you will ever hear told. This is not a story about a woman who was broken by what her husband did to her. This is a story about a woman who decided, very deliberately, that she was going to make sure the truth came out on her terms, not his. Before we go any further, we'd love to know where in the world you're watching this from. Drop your city or your state in the comments below right now. We read every single one, and it always amazes us just how far these stories travel. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The house at the end of Garfield Street in Richmond, Indiana, looked like every other house on that block. A modest single-story home with a concrete driveway, a small front yard that dried out every August, and a porch with 2 chairs that rarely got used. From the outside, there was nothing about it that would make you slow down and look twice. Nothing that would tell you that inside that house, a woman named Sandra Calloway had been quietly, systematically, and deliberately poisoned by the man she had been married to for 19 years. And nothing that would tell you that for the last 90 days of that ordeal, she had known exactly what he was doing, and had been doing something about it, every single night without him ever once suspecting a thing. This story is based on documented real events. The names have been changed to protect those involved, but the facts, the drugs, the hospitals, the confession, the courtroom, and the extraordinary thing Sandra did, those are real. All of it happened, and once you hear it, you will not be able to unhear it. Sandra Calloway was 51 years old in the fall of 2021. She had lived in Richmond, Indiana, for most of her adult life. She was the kind of woman her neighbors described, almost without exception, as steady, not flashy, not loud, not the type to draw attention to. Herself steady, she worked part-time in a dental office on the east side of town. She kept a clean house. She went to church on Sundays when she felt up to it. And she called her sister Margaret every Thursday evening without fail, the way their mother had taught them. She was the kind of woman you trusted immediately upon meeting her. And that trust, it turned out, was entirely deserved. Her husband was named Gary Calloway. He was 68 years old, 20 years her senior, and he had been a part of Sandra's life for over 2 decades. They had met at a community fundraiser in the late 90s, and Gary had been persistent in the way that men of a certain era sometimes were. Charming, attentive, sure of himself. He had been married once before. He had a daughter from that first marriage, a woman named Tanya, who was 32 years old by the fall of 2021, and who had, over the course of Sandra and Gary's marriage, developed what multiple people would later describe as an unusual closeness with her father. Unusual in ways that, at the time, nobody around them could quite bring themselves to name out loud. For most of their marriage, Sandra and Gary had lived what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary life together. They had their rhythms, their routines, their disagreements, and their silences. Gary controlled the finances. Gary decided where they went on vacation. Gary was the one who handled the cars, the insurance, the taxes, the things he categorized as his domain. Sandra ran the household, managed their social calendar, took care of herself and of him. She did not think of this arrangement as unusual. It was simply the shape their marriage had taken, and she had grown accustomed to its contours. The way you grow accustomed to the weight of a coat you've worn for years. You stop noticing it until someone points out that it doesn't fit you anymore. But something had been changing in that house on Garfield Street in the months leading up to September of 2021. Something that Sandra felt before she could name it. A coolness in the air between them that had no clear origin. Gary spending more time on his phone, more time away from the house in the evenings. Tanya calling more often, coming by unannounced in ways she hadn't before. Small things. The kinds of things you file away in the back of your mind without meaning to. Because on their own, none of them mean anything. But together, in retrospect, they formed a pattern. And patterns, as Sandra would later learn, are everything. It started in early September 2021. Sandra would later try to remember exactly when she first felt something was wrong with her body, and she kept coming back to a Tuesday in the first week of that month, She had felt dizzy after dinner. Not dramatically dizzy, not the kind that sends you to the floor, but a slow, creeping dizziness, the kind that settles behind your eyes and makes the room feel like it's leaning slightly to one side. She had gone to bed early that night. She had assumed she was coming down with something. She was not coming down with something. What was happening to Sandra Calloway's body in September of 2021 was far more deliberate than a passing illness, and far more devastating than she could have imagined at the time. Unknown to her, her husband, Gary, had been given a small bottle of white powdery substance by his daughter, Tanya, sometime at the very start of that month. According to what Gary would later confess to law enforcement, Tanya told him to put the powder in Sandra's drinks, not all at once, gradually, regularly, enough to make her sick, enough, eventually, to make her stop being a problem altogether. The substance in that bottle was a mixture of illegal drugs, cocaine, MDMA, and benzodiazepines, drugs that, when combined in the quantities Gary was using, could cause severe neurological distress, organ failure, and over time, death. Gary Calloway, by his own admission, understood this. He would tell investigators later that he knew what the drugs would do to his wife. He knew, and he did it anyway. He sprinkled the powder into her drinks, her juice at dinner, her Coca-Cola in the afternoon, quietly, methodically, without hesitation. The man Sandra had shared her life with for 19 years began the slow, deliberate work of poisoning her to death. Through September and into October of 2021, Sandra's health deteriorated in ways that terrified her and baffled everyone around her. She was exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. She experienced blinding headaches that seemed to come from nowhere and leave just as suddenly. She had episodes of what she described to her sister, Margaret, as feeling like she was falling asleep while she was still awake. A slow, heavy sensation that pulled her under against her will. She went to the emergency room for the first time in late September. The doctors ran tests. They could not explain what was wrong with her. They sent her home. She went back in October, and again in November. 6 times in total. Sandra Calloway was hospitalized, with symptoms that the medical staff, treating her initially, attributed to everything from stress to a possible autoimmune condition. Nobody at that hospital, not a single doctor, not a single nurse, thought to test her for cocaine, not for MDMA, not for benzodiazepines, because Sandra Calloway was a 51-year-old woman from a quiet neighborhood in Richmond, Indiana. She didn't match the profile. And Gary, who drove her to the hospital every single time, who sat in the waiting room with his head bowed, who asked the doctors questions in a voice full of concern, Gary made sure it stayed that way. There is something particularly shattering about the image of a man driving his wife to the hospital to be treated for a condition he himself has caused. There is something that defies easy comprehension about sitting in a waiting room, watching doctors try to save a life you have been methodically working to end. And yet that is exactly what Gary Calloway did, over and over, across those months. Each time Sandra came home from the hospital, he was there. He made her tea. He helped her to the couch. He asked if she needed anything. And then, when she was a little stronger, when she seemed to be recovering, he did it again. The moment everything changed came not from a doctor, not from a detective, not from any of the systems that are supposed to exist to protect people like Sandra Calloway. It came from Sandra herself, and from a Coca-Cola can. In one of her worst episodes, a day in late December 2021, when she felt so suddenly, violently ill that she was convinced she was going to lose consciousness right there in her kitchen, Sandra reached for the can of Coke she had just been drinking from, and she cut it open. She did not know why she did this. She would say later that she simply needed to know. She cut the can open along the seam, and looked inside and saw at the bottom of it a white powdery residue that had no business being there. She stood in her kitchen for a long time after that. The room was quiet. Gary was in the living room. She could hear the television. She stood there and looked at that residue, and she understood, in the way you understand things that change your life forever, that this was what had been making her sick. That this was not a mystery illness. That the mystery had a name, and the name was Gary. She did not cry. She did not confront him. She set the can down carefully on the counter, walked into the living room, sat beside her husband, and said nothing at all. That evening, she called her sister Margaret. She didn't tell Margaret everything, not yet. She asked Margaret to stay on the phone with her. Margaret, who had always been the sharper of the two sisters, the one who asked the harder questions, sensed something in Sandra's voice that she had never heard there before. She asked Sandra if she was safe. Sandra said yes. She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she said it anyway, because she needed to think. And she needed to think clearly. And she could not afford to let Gary know that anything had changed. Not yet. What Sandra did next is the part of this story that I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is extraordinary. She did not leave. She did not immediately go to the police. She did not pack a bag in the night and disappear to Margaret's house. She woke up the next morning and she made breakfast and she poured Gary's coffee, and she acted with a precision and a steadiness that is almost impossible to fully appreciate unless you understand what it cost her, as though nothing had happened, because she had made a decision. She was going to gather evidence. She was going to document everything. And she was going to make absolutely sure that when the truth came out, it could not be denied, minimized, or explained away. For 3 months, 90 days, Sandra Calloway lived a double life inside her own home. On the surface, she was the same wife Gary had always known. She cooked, she cleaned, she watched television beside him in the evenings. She made his tea. She made her own tea. And quietly, without drawing a single moment of suspicion, she began to build a case. She saved the pill bottle she found in the back of a kitchen drawer. She photographed it. She documented the dates when she felt ill. She saved samples of her drinks in small containers that she hid in a shoebox at the back of her closet. She wrote everything down in a notebook. She kept inside a winter coat she rarely wore dates, symptoms, observations, conversations, everything. She also, during those 3 months, began to understand the full shape of what Gary had been planning. Because it was not just the drugs, and it was not just Gary. Tanya's name kept appearing at the edges of the story in ways that Sandra could no longer ignore. The frequency of Tanya's visits, the way Gary and Tanya talked in low voices when they thought Sandra was asleep. The afternoon Sandra came home early from a doctor's appointment and heard Gary on the phone saying words she did not fully catch but understood well enough. She stood in the hallway and she listened. She wrote down what she heard. She put it in the notebook with everything else. There is a particular kind of psychological endurance required to do what Sandra did during those 3 months. To live in proximity to someone who wants to kill you and give no indication that you know. To keep making the tea. To keep setting the table. To keep saying good morning and good night to a man whose plan for your future was a grave. Most people, when they discuss what Sandra did, describe it as bravery. And it was bravery. But it was also something more calculated than that. Sandra Calloway, somewhere in those 90 days, had decided that she was not going to let Gary control how this ended. He had taken enough from her already. The ending was going to be hers. And so she stopped taking the drinks he gave her whenever she could do so, without him noticing. She poured them out. She switched the cups. She found ways, with a patience that speaks to something remarkable in her character, to make sure that what he was putting into her drinks did not reach her body, while making sure he believed his plan was still working. She monitored her own health carefully. She stayed in contact with her doctor under the pretense of follow-up visits for her still unexplained illness. She told the doctor quietly, carefully, that she believed she had been poisoned. The doctor believed her. Tests confirmed it. She asked the doctor to document everything and to say nothing to Gary. The doctor agreed. January 3, 2022 began like any other day on Garfield Street. Sandra made breakfast. Gary ate it. At some point that morning, Gary told Sandra something. He told her, in words she would repeat to law enforcement within hours, that he had been putting a substance in her drinks. He said he felt bad about it. He said he wanted her to know. What prompted this confession, whether it was guilt, or fear that she had already figured it out, or something else entirely, has never been entirely clear. But Gary Calloway, on the morning of January 3, 2022, told his wife that he had been trying to poison her. And Sandra, who had known for 3 months, who had a notebook full of evidence and a shoebox full of samples and a doctor's statement already waiting, looked at him and said she understood. And then she picked up the phone. Law enforcement arrived at the house on Garfield Street that same morning. Sandra handed over the notebook. She handed over the samples. She handed over the photographs and the pill bottle and the doctor's documentation. She told the officers everything she knew, in order, calmly, without tears, without hysteria, with the composed and methodical precision of a woman who had been preparing for this conversation for 90 days. The officers, by all accounts, were taken aback, not by the crime, which was horrifying enough, but by the evidence. In a case like this, investigators almost never arrive to find a victim who has done this much of their work for them. Gary Calloway was arrested that day. In the affidavit filed by the Wayne County Sheriff's Department, investigators documented his confession in detail. Gary admitted to putting the powdery substance, the cocktail of cocaine, MDMA, and benzodiazepines, into Sandra's drinks approximately 12 times between the beginning of September and the end of December 2021. He admitted taking Sandra to the hospital 6 times for the symptoms his own actions had caused. He admitted that his daughter Tanya had supplied him with the drugs and had told him to put them in Sandra's drinks too. In Tanya's words, according to Gary, "Get her out of the picture." He admitted that he had known the drugs could kill her. And then, in one of the most quietly devastating lines in that entire document, Gary Calloway told investigators that his ultimate goal had been to kill his wife so that he could be with Tanya afterward. Let that land for a moment. 19 years of marriage, 19 years of meals and arguments and holidays and quiet Sunday mornings and all the small accumulated weight of a shared life. And the man at the center of all of it had been trying to end it, trying to end her, so that he could be free of her and be with someone else. The audacity of that, the coldness of it, and the fact that Sandra had felt it coming before she ever had a name for it, had felt the shift in the air of that house months before she found the residue in that Coca-Cola can. That is what makes this story impossible to dismiss. The Wayne County Sheriff's Department moved quickly after Gary's arrest. The investigation that followed was thorough, and what it uncovered painted a picture far more complex and far more disturbing than a single man acting alone. Tanya's name, which Gary had introduced into his confession almost immediately, became a central focus. According to what Gary told investigators, it was Tanya who had first suggested the plan, Tanya who had provided the drugs, and Tanya who had characterized it as simply getting her mother out of the picture, as though Sandra's life were an obstacle to be cleared, rather than a person to be protected. Investigators also documented that a friend of Tanya's had allegedly been involved in sourcing the drugs used in the poisonings. According to Gary's account, this friend had hinted that after Sandra was gone, she and Tanya had plans that involved Gary as well. Whether that was true, or whether it was Gary attempting to distribute the moral weight of what he'd done, is something the investigation tried to establish. Tanya denied any involvement. Her friend denied any involvement. Gary had confessed. And so the question of exactly where the responsibility began and ended in this case became one of the central challenges facing the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. In the months after his arrest, Gary Calloway was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, a felony charge that reflected investigators' understanding of exactly what this plan had been designed to achieve. Sandra, meanwhile, had left the house on Garfield Street and moved in with her sister Margaret. She was still recovering physically. 6 hospitalizations, months of being dosed with a cocktail of illegal substances, take a toll that does not simply disappear when the source of the harm is removed. Sandra had doctors. She had Margaret. She had the notebook and the shoebox full of evidence and the quiet, steady knowledge that she had done everything right. That knowledge, by her own account, was the thing that kept her anchored. The legal proceedings in the case of Gary Calloway moved through the Wayne County court system over the following year and a half. Gary, who had entered his confession voluntarily, now had to face the formal weight of the justice system. His defense attorney, in conversations with reporters, would argue that his client had taken responsibility for his actions and deserved to be measured by his remorse as well as his crimes. It was not an unusual argument. It is, in fact, the argument defense attorneys are expected to make. But the facts of the case, the 12 poisonings, the 6 hospitalizations, the admission that the goal had been Sandra's death, made mercy a complicated proposition. In the summer of 2024, Gary Calloway entered a guilty plea in Wayne County court. The original charge of conspiracy to commit murder was dismissed. As part of a plea agreement, he pled guilty instead to aggravated battery posing a risk of death, a level 3 felony under Indiana state law. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. He would serve his time, and then he would walk out of prison while Sandra Calloway still carried in her body the effects of what he had done to her. The reaction to that sentence was complicated, to say the least. For years, for 12 deliberate poisonings, for 6 emergency hospitalizations, for his stated intention to kill the woman he had married so that he could be with someone else. For years, people who had followed the case closely, who had read the affidavit and understood the full scope of what Gary had done, found the sentence difficult to reconcile with the crime. Sandra herself said very little publicly about the sentencing. Her sister Margaret spoke briefly to a local reporter outside the courthouse and said that her sister was alive, and that her sister was well, and that her sister was grateful. She did not say more than that. What happened to Tanya is a question that sits at the center of this story and has never been fully resolved. At the time of Gary's sentencing, investigators had not yet filed charges against Tanya or her friend. They remained, in the language of the official statement released, by the Wayne County Sheriff's Department, persons of interest in a continuing investigation. Whether charges were eventually brought, and what form those proceedings took, has not been definitively established in the public record. What is established is this: a woman supplied drugs to a man who used them to poison his wife 12 times. Whether the legal system found a way to hold her accountable for that is, depending on your faith in that system, either a story of justice delayed or justice denied. There is something deeply important to sit within: the gap between what Gary Calloway did and the 4 years he received for it. Because that gap is not unique to this case across the United States. Across the last several decades, the pattern of one spouse slowly, systematically, deliberately harming another, chemical control, as legal scholars have begun to call it, has been treated by courts as a lesser offense than its reality warrants. The harm is diffuse, the evidence is often internal to the body. The victim is frequently disbelieved, dismissed, told they are imagining symptoms that have, in fact, been deliberately induced. Sandra Calloway was lucky in ways that most victims of this kind of abuse are not. She figured it out. She built a case. She had a doctor who listened to her. She had a sister who stayed on the phone. Not everyone does. After the sentencing, Sandra Calloway did not speak publicly for a long time. She was not hiding. She was healing. She continued to work with her doctors to address the physical effects of what had been done to her body over those months. The combination of substances Gary had used had done real damage to her liver, to her neurological function, to the way she slept and the way she experienced pain. Recovery from something like that is not a clean, straightforward process. It is slow, and it is non-linear, and it requires a kind of patience with your own body. That is in some ways the hardest patience of all. She also, in the months after the trial, began to speak quietly and privately to other women who had found themselves in similar situations, who had dismissed their own symptoms for too long because they trusted the person creating those symptoms, who had been told by doctors and by family members and sometimes by themselves that they were simply stressed, simply anxious, simply getting older. Sandra talked to those women not as a survivor performing her recovery for an audience, but as someone who knew what it felt like to stand in a kitchen and cut open a can and understand in an instant that everything you had believed about your life was not true. She talked to them because she remembered how alone that feeling was, and she did not want any of them to feel that alone. The notebook she had kept during those 90 days became, in a sense, its own kind of testament. Every entry in it represented a day Sandra Calloway chose not to panic, not to run, not to let Gary control what happened next. Every entry represented the decision, made quietly and renewed every morning, to gather the truth, carefully and completely, and make sure it could not be dismissed. There is something in that notebook, in the discipline and the courage and the cold, clear-eyed patience it represents, that says more about Sandra Calloway than any courtroom verdict ever could. Her sister Margaret, who has remained her closest confidant throughout all of this, said something to a mutual friend in the months after the trial that has stayed with everyone who heard it. She said that people kept asking her how Sandra was doing, and she kept answering the same way. She said, "Sandra is doing exactly what she has always done. She is handling it. That is who Sandra is. That is who she has always been. And that, if you want to understand what happened in that house on Garfield Street, is the most important thing I can tell you. This story is not an isolated incident, and it would be wrong to tell it as though it were. The deliberate drugging of an intimate partner, whether the substance is a prescription sedative, an illegal powder, a chemical compound dissolved into food or drink, is a form of abuse that is far more common than most people realize, and far less frequently prosecuted than it deserves to be. Researchers who study coercive, control, and intimate relationships have documented this pattern across dozens of case studies in the United States alone. The victim, almost invariably, is the last person to understand what is happening to them, because the person doing it is the person they trust most in the world. In the documented cases that have been made public, in Indiana, in California, in England, in France, across the spectrum of wealth and education and geography, there are certain details that recur with a consistency that is not coincidental. The victim begins experiencing symptoms they cannot explain. They go to the doctor. The doctor, seeing a person who does not match the typical profile of drug exposure, looks elsewhere for the cause. The victim is sent home. The symptoms continue. The hospitalizations accumulate. The person responsible in most of these cases accompanies their victim to the hospital, expresses concern, and returns home to do it again. The proximity that makes intimate partnership possible, the shared kitchen, the shared table, the shared cup, is the same proximity that makes this form of abuse so devastatingly effective and so devastatingly hard to detect. In 2024, the state of New Jersey updated its domestic violence statutes to formally recognize chemical control, the deliberate use of substances to incapacitate, harm, or psychologically destabilize an intimate partner, as a form of coercive control. Legal advocates who worked on that legislation pointed to cases like Sandra's as the reason the change was necessary, not because Sandra was unique, but because Sandra was representative. Because behind every case that reaches a courtroom, there are dozens that never do. Cases where the victim never figures it out. Cases where the victim figures it out but is not believed. Cases where the evidence exists but is never gathered carefully enough to survive a defense attorney's cross-examination. Sandra's case was the exception. The rule is much darker, and much quieter, and much less likely to end with a notebook in a shoe box and a woman walking out of a courthouse with her sister. There is also the question, the one that follows every story like this one, of what we owe each other as the people around those most vulnerable to this kind of harm. The doctors who treated Sandra 6 times and did not test for illegal substances. The neighbors who saw nothing, heard nothing, reported nothing. The systems that are supposed to exist precisely for situations like this one, that in Sandra's case did not activate until she activated them herself. None of these failures are unique to Richmond, Indiana. They are structural. They are the shape of how we have historically responded to harm that happens behind closed doors, between people who are supposed to love each other, in kitchens that look like every other kitchen on the block. Sandra Calloway is still in Indiana. She is still in contact with her doctors. She is still, by the account of everyone who knows her, steady. She has rebuilt a life that looks different from the one she had before, smaller in some ways, and larger in others. She has her sister. She has her community. She has, in a sense, the knowledge that what she did in those 90 days, the patience, the precision, the quiet refusal to let Gary control how the truth emerged mattered. It mattered to the prosecution. It mattered to the case. And it matters, if you let it. As an example of something genuinely rare, a person who, in the middle of the worst experience of their life, found a way to think clearly, act strategically, and protect themselves when the systems designed to protect them had not yet arrived. Gary Calloway is in prison. He will be released. He will serve his 5 years of probation. He will, at some point, return to a life that resembles ordinary life, in a way that Sandra Calloway spent years trying to build and had, systematically, dismantled from the inside out. Whether that is justice depends, I suppose, on how you define the word. The law has its definition. Sandra has hers. And we, watching from the outside, are left to wrestle with the distance between the two. What Gary Calloway did to Sandra was not a crime of passion. It was not a moment of rage or a terrible decision made in a single desperate instant. It was planned. It was methodical. It was repeated 12 times over for months. And it was done with the specificity of intent. The drugs chosen, the doses calculated, the hospital visits managed. That speaks to a coldness of purpose that for years in prison does not begin to adequately answer. The sentence he received is the sentence the law provided. Whether the law provided enough is a question worth asking out loud and continuing to ask until the answer improves. Tanya has never been charged. Her friend has never been charged. The investigation that was described as continuing in the official statement from the Wayne County Sheriff's Department has not, as of this telling, produced additional prosecutions. The drugs that were used to poison Sandra Calloway were supplied by someone other than Gary, used with the encouragement of someone other than Gary, and aimed at a goal that served the interest of people other than Gary. The full accountability of this story demands has not yet been delivered. That, too, is worth saying plainly. And Sandra, who keeps her own counsel, who has never given a formal interview, who told her story to law enforcement and let that be sufficient. Sandra does not appear to be waiting for additional accountability to arrive before she gets on with her life. She is already living it. She has already moved on in the direction of herself, as people who survive great harm sometimes do, becoming more fully who they were always going to be rather than less. That is not a small thing. That, in a story full of terrible things, might be the most remarkable thing of all. A man made his wife a drink. He put something in it that was meant to kill her. He did it 12 times. She figured it out. She gathered the evidence. She waited. And then she handed the truth to the people whose job it was to act on it, fully formed and irrefutable, from the quiet dignity of a woman who had decided that her story was going to be told on her own terms. That is the story of Sandra Calloway and what happened on Garfield Street in Richmond, Indiana. It is not a comfortable story. It is not a story with a clean or satisfying ending, but it is a true one. And true stories, the ones that show us what people are actually capable of, in both directions, are the only ones that can teach us anything real. So here is the question I want to leave you with today, and I want you to take it seriously, because it deserves a serious answer. If the person you trusted most in the world, the person you shared every meal with, the person who knew every detail of your daily routine, if that person decided one day to use that knowledge against you, would you know? Would you notice the shift? Would you trust your own instincts when they told you something was wrong? Or would you dismiss them the way so many people, in so many cases like this one, have been taught to dismiss them? Leave your answer below. Tell us where you're watching from, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because the conversations that come after stories like this, one, are not just commentary, they are protection. And before we go, if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it is sitting with you the way these stories sit with us when we spend time with them, please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we cover stories like this one every week. Stories about real people, real decisions, real consequences. Stories that don't let you off easy. That's what we're here for. We'll see you next time.